I'm Patrick Yu, a junior in the School of Foreign Service and a member of Congressman Patrick Murphy's Student Strategy Team. Tonight, we're joined by former Congressman Patrick Murphy, former Congressman David Jolly, and Jill Lawrence, who will serve as the moderator.
And they've been talking about the structural problems that have created gridlock in Congress and the impact that has on policymaking and politics in our country. And so why don't we start with the two of you talking about some of the obstacles that you see to accomplishing anything.
Sure. Thank you, Jill, and thank you to Georgetown. Thank you to each one of you all for being here tonight. We do want to kind of pull the curtain back on some of the, at times, structural challenges and at times just personality challenges, if you will, within the Congress, but also get to questions as well and make this as interactive as possible. A little bit of background on me. When I was first elected, I was thinking about this today. I think it's true of you as well, Patrick. The first time I ever ran for anything was running for Congress. I had no electoral political experience before that. Got into a special election race for the House. And when I first entered the race, I was thinking about this. I was polling, you ready for this? I was polling at 1.5%. And the margin of error was 4. As it turned out, I ended up winning the primary and ultimately winning election to the House in what was an incredibly expensive race, much like Patrick's, in a true purple district, 50-50. It had voted for President Obama twice, but elected myself as a Republican, ultimately through 2 election cycles. And I was somewhat naive, thinking that I would get into this and it would be simply a grassroots, person-to-person campaign. I believed in all of the optimism of politics. I didn't think I would really have to raise a lot of money, nor did I think I would ever need a poll. But I quickly learned that both those were actually not true. But what I saw in going from 1.5% to actually winning the election to then getting to the House were structural challenges that at times result in the success of candidates, but also insulate and protect incumbency and actually reward a bit of the dysfunction we see, right? Why isn't Congress working? Well, it turns out because there are these structural mechanisms that ultimately reward divide and gridlock. So 3 quick things, and Patrick's going to speak of some as well. 3 quick things I highlight. The first, obviously, is campaign finance. Whatever your opinion on what the solution is, we all know, if we're truthful to ourselves, that the current system is not working and that the current system is not the best system for democracy. And so we know about the large amount of money. One of the things I worked on was the amount of time that your members of Congress are spending raising money and not actually doing their job. There are advocates for public financing. There are advocates for just a complete free market, disclosure-based system. The reality is, outside of Citizens United, there's still 75 to 80% of the reforms we could accomplish today without having to revisit the Supreme Court. But 2 of them that really also taught me a lot of lessons. The second one being the impact of gerrymandering and district lines. The fact that we have supermajority districts that insulate members of Congress and cause them to cater only to their party's ideology. And in fact, in today's very toxic environment, if one of those members reaches across the aisle and works with the other party, they're usually primaried, they're punished. And so there's a lack of incentive for actually working together. Not saying you have to be a centrist, but you can be a progressive or a conservative. The reality is, if you reach across the aisle, you're often punished and primaried, and frankly suffer internal consequences from your own leadership as well. And then finally, the primary system. In 12 states, we have closed primaries. Some states have open, some have modified systems. But this, again, just reinforces these supermajority party-controlled districts that isolate and insulate and protect partisan members of Congress. If you are in a closed primary state, whether you're a first-time candidate or running for re-election, your messaging from the very first day you enter politics is either going to be far to the right if you're a Republican or far to the left if you're a Democrat. Because you see very little of your hardest partisan voters who turn out in primaries, you see very little centrism from them. They're usually your most active, most ideological. So we have a system that's set up where you enter into a primary and you have to message as far to the extreme as you can, and then you run in a gerrymandered district that protects that extreme. You get to Congress, you're rewarded by high dollar donations from organizations that support that extreme agenda. And the reality is, all you have to do then is follow along your party's ideology, never compromise, and you'll be rewarded with re-election. But who loses are the voters who are asking, why can't we understand all this discord and dysfunction? So we will have several examples of those tonight, from immigration reform to gun control to the Pulse nightclub and other incidents. But what Patrick and I are hoping to do is maybe pull the curtain back on some of the current problems, but then revisit how we can fix it. Because the reality in states across the country, we are seeing voter-driven ballot initiatives to open primaries or to create jungle primaries. We're seeing redistricting ballot initiatives. Arizona has an independent commission. Florida is requiring geographically fair districts. There are ways we can fix this as voters and actually take the power out of the hands of the incumbents who are protected by these mechanisms.
Great. Well, thank you, David. Number one, thank you for wearing a tie. You see, whoever wears a tie goes first in these panels. So you do the short straw tonight, which means I just get to tell stories. So, Jill, thank you as well for moderating. Look forward to hearing some of your thoughts and opinions. And thank you for all the students that are here, everyone for coming out. At the end of the day, it's probably going to take a new generation to affect some of the changes that we want to instill in some of the problems that we've seen firsthand in the Congress. So I look forward to your questions and thoughts as well. I also got to give a shout out to Patrick, my buddy who introduced us. You went to the same high school, so yeah, go Elbo. So we want to talk about some of the structural problems and want to point all those out. But I'm going to start just with a quick story that I think puts into perspective pretty well some of the problems. So starting the Congress is much like starting college. You have orientation, right? And they tell you, how to vote, how to do an amendment and security, just like the basics, how to get around. And in some ways, they put you together and let you meet the other party. The whole freshman class, my class I think was 89 people, pretty big class. But what they also do is they separate you. And they put all the Republicans over here for like a week, and they put all the Democrats here for a week. You say, wait a minute. If you're going to break down these sort of artificial barriers, you're going to have to do it in the beginning, before you sort of build up this hatred almost. And I was shocked how right off the bat I meet a freshman Republican, Tea Party guy actually, and we went to dinner one night, we started talking, and we realized that we actually agreed on more than we disagreed on, right, as it relates especially to fiscal issues. We said, well, what the heck, if you agree and I agree, why don't we start something here? Long story short, we started a freshman bipartisan group called United Solutions. We said, well, let's put something forward that makes sense, that we can all agree on, that we care about. We decided to start with government waste, fraud, abuse, and duplication, right? Common sense stuff. And we ended up finding like $400 billion, right? Billion, of wasteful government spending, right? That's your taxpayer money. And we said, well, let's go ahead and put this bill forward. So we're getting ready to introduce the bill. And my colleague knows me and says, hey, Murph, look, I got to give it another week. I got some problems. I got to do something here. Give me a week. So and a week goes by. Then another week goes by. And then another week goes by. Next thing you know, it's like 5 weeks. And I see him out one night. And I'm like, hey, what's going on here? Something didn't smell right. He says, Murph, look, here's the deal. He'd had a couple of drinks, He says, Murph, look, here's the deal. You're in a seat that we really want to win. And the speaker told me if I were to work with you, it might give you a good headline back home. Murphy saves taxpayer money. So I was basically threatened by the speaker, if I work with you, that we're going to cut off your funding and drop you from your committee. So, hey, Murph, if you're here in 5 years, be happy to work with you then. I was thinking, wait a minute, $400 billion of government wasteful spending we're trying to cut, and he's not allowed to work with me. And that isn't intended to be a partisan statement or story. Because both parties do that, right? Both parties are playing those nonsense games, right? Democrats, in large part, didn't want to work with Congressman Jolly because he was in a tough seat that they were trying to beat him in. So think of the games, and that's just one little story that happens every single day for common sense solutions that aren't being solved. And what I realized very early on, because that happened my first few weeks in Congress, was that it's not necessarily bad people serving, right? They're not dumb, they're not lazy, they're not all the bad things you hear, maybe some of them. But not all that. But there are structural problems ripping them apart, us apart, that it actually prohibits us from getting anything done, where you're more incentivized to go to the extreme than you are to the middle. So just real quick, I'll run through them and then we'll tell some stories and get into a little bit more.
Maybe I'll ask a question or two.
Yeah. We'll just keep talking.
I said it, you don't have a filibuster.
Okay, fine, let's go to the question. So I was tracking, there's so many problems here. The gerrymandering, probably the single biggest problem. The money, and David had the courage to stand up and talk about that on 60 Minutes and other venues about just how bad it is. The media, no offense, fake news. The media becoming more and more partisan, and people becoming more rigid in their beliefs. Then you have the lack of relationships, right? Members of Congress used to live in DC, they were real friends. You have very little of that anymore. Then you have earmarks that are no longer existent, no more regular order. And the last one are cameras in the committee rooms, which I'll tell some stories about, but whenever there's a camera on, members of Congress often start pandering to that camera. And what it does is move the real discussion behind closed doors where there's no cameras. So it actually becomes less transparent for the voters.
Yeah, one of the things I discovered in writing the book about negotiations is that the less transparency and the more privacy there was, the better off the result was, which is very counterintuitive. You just would not expect that. It's not something we value. But I want to ask you, it sounds like a lot of what you're talking about to correct some of the structural problems is at the state level. And there's a lot of arguments against some of the things you're talking about. Well, first of all, state parties want to choose their own candidates. They don't want an open primary, where anyone can vote. A Democrat can vote for a Republican candidate. So there's that problem. The problem with gerrymandering is who's interested in it. How esoteric is that? It has a huge impact. I agree with you, but how do you get people to care about it?
So, if I could, I love this question for this reason. In today's environment, the solutions aren't making a lot of news, but they're actually moving along at a pretty quick pace. So if you take redistricting, I will tell you, this is an issue that I think is continuing to catch the attention of a lot of people who realize if you are part of a minority political constituency in a supermajority district, you don't have a representation. You don't have a voice. Patrick points out 90% of the seats in Congress are already decided. They belong to one party or the other, and they're never competitive. So what we've seen in Arizona, the voters at the state level, so federal district lines are drawn by state legislatures. So voters can amend their state constitution to put requirements for how those lines are drawn. In Arizona, the voters said, we want an independent redistricting commission. Take it out of the hands of the Arizona state legislature. They passed it. The legislature sued to say, no, you can't take away our authority. And the Supreme Court of the United States said, yes, they can. The Supreme Court has said if you have voter-driven ballot initiatives, you can change how lines are drawn. In Florida, we saw it through a movement called Fair Districts to require the legislators to draw geographically compact districts. So it would be just as simple to say we want electorally competitive districts. That is one way to do it on gerrymandering. On primaries, you're seeing the same thing. California just went to a top two process where, and again, it was a voter-driven ballot initiative where the top two vote getters moved to the election regardless of party. There are some proposals out there because, you're right, most parties say we should only let our party choose our nominee, that if there's something that sounds right about it. The problem in a lot of states, including Florida, is a third of your voters are then disenfranchised from primary elections because a third of your voters are no party affiliates or independents. So there's this movement now saying, okay, let's let the parties nominate, but that just appears on the ballot as the party nominated that candidate. You can have other Republicans on the ballot as well. You can have other Democrats on the ballot as well. It doesn't take away that authority. There is a value judgment in this primary conversation, and I've simply made the decision that closed primaries are quieting democracy, and for me, I'll take the heat from the parties who say we need closed primaries for our own party and say no, let's open it up.
I'll just add a little bit to that. I fully agree, but you think about where most millennials are registering nowadays, and it's almost by factor, I think 3 to 1 registering as NPAs or independents, right? Because they don't like either party, and you almost can't blame them right now for what they've seen or not seen, the progress they haven't seen. So if we think it's a problem now, when we got 1/3 of people that can't vote in primaries in states like Florida, 5, 10, 15 years from now, if there aren't changes, it's going to be an even larger piece of the population that is alienated. And to your point, Joe, people say to David and I all the time, these problems be so hard to solve, and is it realistic you can do something? And the truth is, as I think you all know, these are initiatives, ballot initiatives. In many cases, we get started by an individual, right? Get a group of people together if you're passionate about something and start getting signatures, right? Start doing what you can to raise awareness on that issue. These aren't like problems you have to wait for the president to solve or something. These are things citizens can do in any state.
And any portions of this you may agree with, there are usually advocacy organizations already in place organizing. Like Fair Districts was largely coordinated through League of Women Voters, I believe. And there are certainly groups in Washington, D.C. that are pushing these organizing advocacy campaigns throughout states. So if there's a particular issue you feel particularly strong about, look to get involved in one of those organizations.
You touched on this a little bit, the donor problem. The donors reward certain types of messaging, and the rhetoric of particularly the Republican Party the last few years, when they weren't in power, was all repeal and replace, and this was a huge fundraising driver, and expectations were raised, and they now seem to have gotten themselves into a cul-de-sac with this. And I was just wondering, how damaging is this interrelationship between the donors and the campaigns and the party organizations, and just this kind of trapping you in rhetoric that's going to be very hard to actually get to materialize.
I'll start off with it. So it's a problem in many factors, first of which you just identified, but what it does is whether candidates admit it or not, inherently in the back of your mind somewhere, you have to raise money to get elected to office, right? I don't like the rules, you don't like them, that's just the way it is right now. So what happens then is you take my first election against Alan West, for example, who would say some outrageous things online. And next you know, he'd click send on an email and raise, $500,000 because he just called Debbie Wasserman Schultz a communist or something, and raise money by saying more extreme things. And Democrats, right, do the same thing. So you all of a sudden start getting rewarded financially for your campaign by saying obnoxious comments in many ways, and raising the bar and the sort of the level of commentary around an issue that isn't realistic. And that's one piece of it. And the other piece is not just the PACs anymore, which are almost small, or are small compared to these super PACs that are out there. And David and I know several members of Congress that are still in office right now that have recently taken votes that we know 100% is against what they know is the best thing to do. Right? And that's a really sad state of affairs because they did it for the money. And they know that there could be millions of dollars that went against them or will go for them if they take a vote, one way or the other. And that's the sort of the epitome of what's wrong with the money. Not to mention the fact that members of Congress are spending 30 to 40 hours a week on the phone like a telemarketer begging people for money all the time.
Let me expand on that on one point that I don't think most voters fully appreciate, and that is post-Citizens United. The amount of independent, uncoordinated money, these super PACs where the candidate doesn't have the opportunity to work with them or coordinate a message. The challenge there for the candidate becomes this. As a percentage of campaign spending, the amount spent by these super PACs continues to grow and grow and grow. So in my race, for instance, my first race, there was about $14 million spent. The candidates only raised and spent maybe $3 million of that. So you had $10 to $11 million that was totally uncoordinated. And what we're going to see in the years to come is the candidates' ability to raise money and message is going to continue to get drowned out by the super PACs. Even the super PACs who are supporting that candidate. The individual is not able to choose what that message is. And so what happens then, Jill, is that is always reminding members of Congress on big votes who's going to be with them or not come election time. In my first election, all those outside groups started spending money to support Jolly. And then I started voting, and they all receded and kind of moved away because I wasn't a hardline enough conservative for a lot of these groups. And I knew that was a risk I was taking, that we might not have the super PAC money coming in. I do want to say on that, only because we have friends here from Issue 1. Issue 1 is a bipartisan group of former members concerned that big money and the current construct of campaign finance rules are rigging and disrupting democracy. And so when we talk about primaries and gerrymandering and campaign finance initiatives, these are something that if you have interest in it, you have allies out there. There are allies out there that are more than ready to work with you and help you on that journey towards reform.
You've said that it will take a scandal to make us change the campaign finance system. What do you have in mind? And if you've got something to add to that too, I'd like to.
This one.
What will it take? I mean, surely it's sleazy enough the way it is now, right? I mean, we can all see the problems with it. You've just talked about them. So what will it take?
Well, so we see reforms come out of scandals. The insider trading, the Stock Act that was about insider trading, members of Congress trading on inside information, led to new restrictions on the ability of members of Congress to change or how they could use non-public information for stock trading. You know, as I mentioned at the beginning, much of the campaign finance reform changes could be made without a scandal or without revisiting Citizens United. The idea of could you restrict lobbyists from contributing to specific members with jurisdiction on those issues. Patrick has an idea about limiting the window of time where members can engage in fundraising. You know, narrow it down to say the 90 days before an election or the 6 months before an election. I saw what I thought was a scandal, which is both parties. We just happened to have a PowerPoint slide from the Democrats, an orientation slide that said members of Congress are expected to spend 4 to 5 hours a day raising money, not in their office, but across the street at party headquarters, calling people, asking them for money. Well, extrapolate that out, that's 20 plus hours of call time, fundraising call time, and then you have a fundraising breakfast, a fundraising lunch, and a fundraising dinner. And there's no wonder nothing's getting done on the Hill because we have a part-time Congress and a full-time world. And to me, I thought that was a scandal, so I introduced I think just a 2 or 3 page bill that said no member of Congress should be able to directly solicit a campaign contribution. Didn't make me a lot of friends on the Hill, but it was certainly something that I believed was a response to what should be a first-rate scandal in politics today, which is you have members of Congress more concerned with raising money than doing their job.
What would it take and what would you like to see happen?
There's no doubt that a scandal wouldn't hurt change it. And members of Congress don't like this. Right? It's not like they like sitting in a room begging people for money with 3 people there handing you call sheets. I speak for myself, but I know David's the same. I got into public service naive and hoping and thinking that it was all about policy and getting down to the details of tax reform. Right? I was one of 8 CPAs in the Congress, and as dorky as that may sound, I want to be involved in tax reform. Right? I want to get to the nitty-gritty. I want to be involved in infrastructure. I love foreign affairs. But then you get there and you realize that the majority of your time, oftentimes, has to do with fundraising one way or the other.
And let's just pull the curtain back so everybody kind of understands this. So any member of Congress is going to have to raise a couple $1 million for their own campaign. And then the party says to you, on top of that, we need, if you're going to be on this committee, you need to raise $1 million for the party. And so then that's an additional requirement. And so they prioritize fundraising time. Your staff is told to prioritize fundraising time. And without getting too far into names, to really tell you how this works, there are call centers in both party headquarters, these little closets where you go into, and a fundraiser hands you a call sheet and says, hey, call Jane. Last year, Jane was able to give $12,000 to candidates. She likes Doberman Pinschers, and she vacations in Aruba. And so you call, hey Jane, how you doing? How's your Dobie doing? And how was Aruba? Right? And all of a sudden, Jane's talking to you, and you say, great, I could really use $1,000. That's the way this works. It's so bad that during one of my visits to the Senate side a year or so ago, I walked into a room and there were 5 sitting U.S. senators. 5 sitting U.S. senators in the middle of the afternoon, each at a table making phone calls with a staffer handing them a profile on the person they were calling, and a sixth senator in charge of fundraising that day walking around the room like a pit boss, making sure they were raising money. And it was nothing more than a call center. If the senator couldn't close the deal, they'd say, hold on just a second, I've got a colleague here who wants to talk to you. And they'd hand the phone up to the pit boss, who would then try to close the deal. That's your United States Senate today. It is a scandal, and we should be angry about it, and we should try to fix it.
We were telemarketers with cool titles, right? That's basically what we were. Every now and then we got to get involved in policy, but what's even worse is one more layer on that was what leadership does. It says, hey, Dave, you want to be in this committee? You want to do this? Well, now you got to raise the money to do that. So they put pressure on you. They don't, just give you a piece of paper. They say, hey, if you want to move up the ladder, you better do this.
Just very quickly, because we have to get to the president. Is public...
We don't have to.
Well, no. The man who wrote the Art of the Deal, we don't.
So.
Does public financing figure in this at all? Is there any way that anything like that could help?
So on campaign finance,
Yeah.
so I would encourage you to think of campaign finance in 3 lanes. On one side, you have straight public financing, which would be tax dollars, or some are advocating tax credits, if you will. On the other side, the typically more conservative approach is there shouldn't be any limits. That as long as you disclose everything immediately, that's just money is speech. The courts have said that, and so just requires sunlight. In the middle are kind of what I call these value judgment reform proposals, right? From my bill to say members shouldn't be directly asking, to proposals to say lobbyists shouldn't do this, to Patrick's that it should be 60 to 90 day window. I think we're all going to come down to a different answer on that, but what I would encourage people to do is, if public financing is impossible, and if unlimited spending and full disclosure is bad for democracy, begin to think about that middle lane. Where are the value judgment reform proposals that we could reach consensus on today and begin to move on those?
Your ideas, all of them, sound better than the McCain-Feingold approach of limiting money from various places. I mean, that gets so granular, and it didn't work.
Well, it pushed money to all these outside groups that are now uncoordinated. So, the unintended consequence of McCain-Feingold was you took the coordination out and you took the candidates and the parties out of much of the process.
So let's just talk about President Trump for a minute, because
This is for Patrick.
A lot of people didn't notice this, but in all the debates he talked about making deals and how he was going to make deals and he was going to compromise, and he's had a lot of problems. One of his problems is the Republican Party, right? Because they can't agree on anything within themselves. But I'm just kind of curious about how you see this unfolding, and whether there's any hope for this president being able to bridge any gaps.
So, as much as I would just want to lean in and bash President Trump right now, there are, and I will if you like, but there are divisions within both parties, right? There's no doubt that the Republican Party is split, the Democratic Party is split, maybe in 2 or 3 different pieces. So no matter whom was the president right now, you could argue they would have a problem reining everybody in. Back to these sort of structural problems, both parties are incentivized to go to their base, and it's a lot easier to vote no on something than it is to vote yes. I always joke that if it was a secret ballot, that if you didn't know who was casting votes, tax reform would be done in a day. Right, healthcare would be fixed, we'd have infrastructure spending, all these great things would be done if people didn't know how you're voting. So when it comes to President Trump trying to make a deal, I think he missed a huge opportunity by not starting off with infrastructure spending and tax reform. I think he could have talked about being this business person and creating jobs and focused on that light and got a lot of goodwill. Because every Democrat has been talking about tax reform and infrastructure spending for the past however many years or decades. So how could they all of a sudden not go for that? But once he started with DACA and all the other lists of things we could go through, healthcare being probably the biggest, Democrats now, I think it's really interesting to watch what happens in the next few months if there is a tax reform bill. Are there any Democrats that can actually work with President Trump right now without facing the consequences of being called a sellout or without getting a serious primary challenge just for working with them on different issues?
It seemed to work for Chuck and Nancy.
So I would say when you lose credibility You lose the benefit of the doubt. You lose the ability to work together. And this, in many ways, is the tragedy, in my opinion, of Donald Trump. For Republicans, look, there are many Republicans, however conservative a Republican might be, that were looking for a candidate to bring us back from the Tea Party messaging that we saw emerge in 2010, right? And so we had a primary process where a lot of people were looking for that. Frankly, Donald Trump is not someone of any ideological conviction whatsoever. He's not even been a lifelong Republican. He was the deal maker. He's the person that could have brought the party back and frankly the country back from that. But instead of saying, I'm going to work with Chuck and Nancy starting January 21st after the inauguration and be the deal maker that I think his base still would have responded to, right? A guy who still disrupts Washington and says, we're just going to get back to work. I think his base would have stayed with him. Instead, he doubled down on this toxic rhetoric to really flame that most passionate base. And he's isolated people from ever working with him now. Look, when I was in Congress, Patrick was there at the same time that Trump said this. Trump once said, all members of Congress are idiots. Now, you all might agree with that. There might be a 50% ratio here on stage. You can decide, who's who. But, you know, politicians have thick skins. I didn't get upset that he said all members of Congress are idiots. I understood it played well politically. But as a member of Congress, I wasn't going to walk across the street to help the guy with his bag, right? And so what we've seen him do to Corker and to McConnell and to Ryan, and when the House passes their health care bill and they celebrate with champagne on the South Lawn, and then a week later Trump says, well, I thought that health care bill was kind of mean. Yeah. He's lost the art of the deal. He's lost that ability, and it's toxic.
Well, let me throw something a little counterintuitive out there. He's been tossing a lot of things to Congress, like the DACA, the Dreamers, and the Iran deal, and to some extent healthcare, because no one knows where he is on that. I mean, do you think there's some outside chance that because he's abdicating, that Congress will step up? I mean, there are certain things that nobody wants to see. Big majorities don't want to see these kids kicked out of the country. You know, people don't want to see millions lose health care. They don't want us to go to war with Iran. I mean, you know, there's things that might happen because he's just stepping back, or is that too optimistic?
Can I take that as a Republican, because it's a unique perspective. I think, one, he's doing it because he has no understanding of policy. So part of it is just protecting his own image and ego. But I struggle with this question. I love the question. I struggle with it because as a Republican who believes that the founders saw the Article I authority of the Congress to be necessarily the strongest authority, I like to see a president saying, Congress, you fix these issues and put something on my desk. We have seen presidents, Republicans and Democrats throughout modern history, each one of them have tried to grab more executive authority and more executive authority.
And Congress willing to give that up.
And Congress willing to give it up, right? In this case, you have a president who's saying, I'm going to let Congress fix it and bring it to me. He's just, through his messaging, been able to pit the two against each other, and he's not using the moral tools of the bully pulpit to actually unite the country around that message. He's using it to create an enemy in Congress that allows his base to stay with him as president.
Yeah, and you can argue this so many ways, but I think truly it goes back to the Steve Bannon in Trump's head about playing to your base, work before, work again, keep pandering there, and you kind of get it both ways to be able to say, hey, I played to the base with DACA, with healthcare, with Iran, all these things. I'm trying to keep my promises because to him his ego is number one most important. And if Congress doesn't do it, then see, I told you they were dumb. And it then, by the way, sets him up for some help along the way with re-election. And hey, I could have gotten it done if it weren't for these dumb Congress people. Here, I gave them the opportunity. They didn't do anything. I had it done. I did the executive order. So I don't see, regardless of the reason he's doing it, I don't see Congress being able to come around for a deal. Again, back to these structural problems that you were just talking with Trump in the art of the deal. Part of the art of any deal is knowing somebody, right? Is knowing where your kids went to school, knowing something about your district, knowing what motivates you. And those relationships aren't getting any better when Trump is undercutting his own Secretary of State, who's trying to do something with diplomacy in North Korea and prevent nuclear war, and then he undercuts him immediately. if you're going to undercut your right-hand person, you're probably going to undercut someone in the other party as well.
I just feel like maybe if some victory happens, that he'll be able to take credit for it. So, I don't know where that path lies, because sometimes he adopts the Paul Ryan agenda, and sometimes he is, running down the middle of the road. It's just hard to know.
I think, look, he's can only blame himself for this, because he has created chaos that doesn't allow a disciplined message to get through. Imagine in the last 8 months if he had kept his mouth shut and his fingers off Twitter. The truth is, we see an economy that's growing, we see retirement accounts growing. Today during his press conference, for a normal president, he was relatively on message, saying the economy's doing well, we're turning things around, and so forth. The problem is the American people, each one of us, don't really realize some of the good things that are occurring, whether he's responsible for them or not, but the traditionally positive political factors that are occurring, because he continues to create chaos that just sows the seeds of division even further.
Well, on that note, is it time to move for questions? Okay, so let's take some questions from the audience. Okay, how about you? I was just bringing my mic over.
Hey guys, thanks so much for coming. I really enjoyed the discussion. My name's Alec Campbell. I'm a sophomore in the college. You started to touch on this a little bit towards the end, but I know you guys have both had frustrations with the extremes of either party. I'm curious what parallels you might see on the extreme left today compared to the Tea Party in the wake of Obama's election leading up to 2010.
Yeah, it's a great question, because there's a lot of folks on both parties, but certainly the Democratic Party, I would say, hey, look at what the Republicans just got away with. In day one, we want President Obama to be a one-term president, obstruct. And heck, after that, they take back the House, take back the Senate. Majorities are growing in the state legislatures, the governor's mansions. Hey, why not go further left and stick to it and be strong? So there's a growing argument for that what are the consequences Republicans pay? And you could, from a political science standpoint, probably argue that pretty well with some good data. It's hard for me to make that case, because I'm a moderate by nature. I want to see deals made, I want to see things get done, I want to see progress. And I think both extremes are dangerous for our country. I do fear, though, when you look at our country's history, that you constantly have this pendulum swing. And you look at from President Bush to President Obama, the contrast there, and now from President Obama to Trump, and you look at some of the policies that are being implemented. They're swinging more and more dramatically. And you add in some external macro factors, like immigration movements around the world. You look at some of the terrorism fears. You look at some of the displacement in our economy because of automation and artificial intelligence and the sharing economy, and what I would say in the middle of a new industrial revolution because of computers and technology, you have a lot of unrest. You put all these factors together, and I think you're going to see more movements toward extremes because of that.
I love that question. I think it's very insightful, and I think what we're seeing right now is very similar to what we saw with the Tea Party in 2010, with the indivisible movement, if you want to call it that right now. And here's the similarity. The Tea Party movement and what we're seeing on the left today we're both being driven from the grassroots up. There is no political leader in Washington of that movement, right? In fact, the political leadership on the Republican side wasn't quite sure what to do with the Tea Party when it emerged. I'm not sure the Democrats in Washington, who is the leader of the indivisible movement now? Now, there's a good and a bad side to that level of energy. The good thing is you see this new level of involvement, political involvement. The tough thing is there are hard family conversations within a party that frankly are pretty divisive. I'm not sure the Republican Party has ever been able to unite since 2010, where you saw the Tea Party emerge. There were ways to work together, but the Democrats are going to have to figure out now with this grassroots movement, how does it incorporate into a Democratic platform, and who leads the party now going forward? I often quip, personally, I think the Democratic Party is as divided as the Republican Party today. It's just the Republican Party is in control, so that's where the newsworthiness is. The moment you see the Democrats begin to have to identify who's going to be their standard bearer in 2020, I think there's going to be a theme about how does the division within the Democratic Party get resolved.
Could I just follow up on that? What is the future of the Republican Party? They're the ones in charge now. I mean, the Democrats have some time to work this out, but we're looking to Republicans right now to figure this out.
They're both split parties, and I mean, you could argue if there's ever a time for a third party to emerge, now would probably be that time, right, where both parties are in turmoil, and what seems to be missing in both is that sort of moderate, group. I would say I'm fiscally responsible, socially more progressive. Every time I say that, I get everyone, oh yeah, that's me, that's where I'm at, but where's the party for that? Right? You don't seem to have that. So, maybe you see some emergence. I'm not overly optimistic of that. But I think Republicans are in a tough position right now, in large part because of their leader, who doesn't have a clear message or clear ideology.
I think the big question, Jill, is what happens to a post-Trump Republican Party? Does the party double down with this type of brash, independent character that caters to the base, or do we find our way back to some level of mainstream conservatism? If it's the former, I think you see the party fracture significantly from that point on. I recently did an op-ed saying that I think a primary challenge to Trump in 2020 could save the Republican Party. Let's say it's a Kasich or somebody like a Kasich. History, the lessons of history would suggest that primary opponent loses, but it would at least give mainstream Republicans a place to stay within the party, to call home. Because without that, you're going to have a lot of Republicans say, I can't go into 2020 supporting this president. I think both parties, though, need to watch out for this Trump-type profile, right? Do the Democrats get co-opted by some billionaire, brash person from the left because it worked on the right? I don't think that's the best model of a candidate, nor certainly a president.
Other questions?
My name is Anusha, and I'm from California. So obviously California is like the top two, and I'm from a very blue area, so it's often two Democrats. And one of the arguments is for voting for one candidate over the other is seniority. So I was wondering if you could touch on that and whether people should vote for a candidate that has seniority and might be like bought by big money, or whether they should go for like a newer person.
Congress is called the People's House. It is meant to be a constant influx of new ideas and new people. So I think there's a healthy amount of that. What also happens in the Congress and in any institution is a certain amount of institutional knowledge where it's important to have some of that seniority. I think the Republicans have outplayed and outmaneuvered the Democrats in large part on this. Democrats, we pride ourselves on diversity in many different forms. The one thing we don't have diversity in the Congress is with age. I think the average ranking member in the House, I think 74, 72, somewhere in there. So all the faces that the vast majority of people see, they might not identify with entirely. And I think that has hurt the Democratic Party. I think there's a balance in there where you want ranking members and chairs to know what they're talking about. So to your point, specifically in your case, in your district, who can get more done? Yeah, probably the more senior person. Is there a better chance perhaps that they have certain influences or outside things impacting their votes? No doubt about it. But that's where it comes down to the voter to do their research, right? To really look at that person's votes, what's motivating them, what drives them, to get that sense of who they are as a person. And a great question that we've been getting is, should I be voting for the person or should I be voting for the party? And you can kind of go around on this, but you look at a great case study over the next 18 months, we'll be watching the Arizona race. Senator Jeff Flake, who's spoken out, right, known to be a moderate Republican, speaking out now against Trump and his party. Next you know, he's been primaried and could lose that, and if not, could very certainly lose to one of my great friends in Congress, is Kyrsten Sinema, because Democrats aren't going to reward Jeff Flake, right, for being moderate and speaking out. So you have this circle, and once you get there, they tell you, hey, your number one job is to get reelected. So then you get stuck in this cycle. So it's a tough one.
I think seniority by itself is a net good, because that would include some subject matter expertise that an individual can develop and a more effective way of representing their community. When we started out talking about some of these structural problems, from safe districts to big money influence, to closed primaries. What that has done is it has made your most senior members unaccountable, right? They can be there for life because the ability for voters to hold them accountable for effective representation really isn't there. And so the reason we talk about these structural problems, and they can get pretty academic, picture a senior member of Congress in a completely safe district with a closed primary system and all the money in the world. They may be good, they may be bad, that doesn't matter, they're still getting elected. Picture that same member in an open primary state in a 50-50 district. All of a sudden the ability to hold them accountable becomes very real, and you would see a lot of turnover at that point. That would empower voters to be able to determine, do I want this person to stay in for a long time or not? At the state level, particularly in Florida, we've seen term limits, arbitrary term limits, and I think the result of that, I would make the case, has been a net negative, because when the state has faced crisis, we simply don't have the subject matter expertise in the legislature to handle the crisis, because you have people who have only been there for months or just a couple of years.
Hi, I'm Joseph Vegeta. I'm a freshman in the college, majoring in government. One of the things that you talked about frequently is the primary system as being one of the institutional flaws, but specifically you stated that state and party leaders were the problem with the primary system. However, it seems to be the case that individual voters recently have been voting more far right and far left in primary elections. So how can you account for the role individual voters in America have to play in party politics rather than just as party leaders?
Sure. Thanks, Joseph. Great question. So, rough numbers here. About 90% of congressional districts are predetermined, right? They will be Republican or they will be Democratic. If you live in one of those seats, the only election that really matters, of course, is the primary. Right? If you're in a safe Democratic seat, there's no Republican going to beat you in the general, so you got to win your primary. Well, guess what the average voter turnout is in that primary? It's about 15%. So about 15% of the country is determining 90% of your members of Congress. And if you're a member of Congress or you're a candidate, you have this fancy algorithm where I can see the magazines you read and then the cookies and the websites you go to, and I can see where you're from, how many kids you have, and put that into a fancy algorithm and come up with pretty good certainty how you're going to vote and the issues that drive you and who I should be targeting or not. So the candidates know exactly what they have to say, and I took a trip with a very, very conservative Republican. We went to Afghanistan together. And she was the face of the Tea Party movement in many ways. And in person was a totally different person than those TV interviews she gave. And I realized that she had to sort of play a part, right? She was an actress, right? There's this joke in DC that Congress is Hollywood rugby people, right? So you've got these actors, right, playing a part because of that 15% who they know they have to pander to. And then you have the money, right? Who all of a sudden they go say something great, they're going to raise more money, right? And then you have the media who all of a sudden is becoming more and more rigid, whether it's the Fox versus MSNBC or the websites that people go to, or the apps, or even our own friends that we surround ourselves with are often of a similar, right, belief system, and we all become guilty of living in a bubble, right? Personally, I'll tell you, I don't watch Fox News because it makes me mad. I probably would have been better off watching some Fox News a year ago in my election, right? I might have seen things a little bit differently. So we're all guilty of that. So it really does come down to the voter, not only to show up and vote in that primary, but also to be more educated on those issues.
Can I stick a question in here? Now, what would you say to the voter who says, I really like you, both of you. I really like some of your positions, but if I vote for you and you get elected, you're going to vote for, Paul Ryan for Speaker, or Nancy Pelosi for Speaker, or Mitch McConnell for Majority Leader, and you're going to hold up a Supreme Court nomination for a year, or you're going to try to repeal my health care, or your party is going to control things in a way that I don't like, even as much as I might like some of your positions.
Yeah, the myth of the crossover voter. When I took a public stand in support of marriage equality, my political consultant said, congratulations, but you just lost votes, you didn't pick up any. Because as a Republican, the Democrats were already there. It was already part of their platform. And they may have appreciated my independence and appreciated my sincerity on it, but it didn't win me any votes. Whereas within my own party, I lost votes among the most conservative party members. So what you're speaking to is there's been an interesting study out about 10 years ago that tried to study, are voters most interested in the dyadic representation, that is between you and your elected representative, that personal relationship and the decisions they make? Or are you most interested in which party controls Washington? And most of the studies suggest people are more concerned with which party controls Washington because it better reflects their core convictions than that dyadic representation. They're willing to sacrifice some inefficiencies of their personal representation if they can achieve an ideological representation within Washington.
So it doesn't matter how great a candidate you are if you're the wrong party for that cycle or that district.
So I would use this to point out something I always propose, and some agree, some don't. I think on this gerrymandering thing, if we were to require as many electorally competitive districts as possible, meaning as many 50-50 districts, so I represented a district Obama won twice and I won it twice as a Republican. It forced me as a member of Congress to think about the entire constituency every single day, not to focus on my primary. I had to think, how can I get to 51% in a 50-50 district? And so on issues of climate change and other districts or other issues that may be owned by the left, I was more vocal on those. I tried to lead as a Republican on those issues, not abandoning my own party's convictions, but trying to build consensus around them. It got redistricted to a district Obama won by 11 points. And so what does that mean for the Democrat that came in? He doesn't really have to ever pay attention to what the minority Republican constituency cares about, because there's no electoral reward for him doing so. He might want to do it because he's a nice guy, but there's no benefit to him electorally for doing it.
Do you want to?
I was just going to say, so in my first election, 2012, ran against Alan West. We won by, I think, 0.6%, 2,100 votes. 2 years later, in a midterm election, we were able to win by, I think, 20%, right? Which is, midterms traditionally a tougher turnout for Democrats. In large part because a lot of my team that's here tonight, we were able to do that. But we also, as a team, took an approach on local issues that I think cut some of the partisan nonsense out. You know the old saying, all politics is local. So yes, maybe standing on an issue like marriage equality or climate change might still have the national implications of partisanship. If, as a candidate or a member of Congress, you're able to kind of peel that nonsense back and say, hey, as you're a member of Congress, I'm fighting for X, Y, and Z local issue, because that's where you can actually get something done, you can often get a lot of that Republican or whatever the other party is to say, hey, he or she, might not be, what I think on every issue, but they're fighting for me back home. And that's where you see cases like Ileana Ross-Layton in Miami would be a great example of a Republican winning in a very Democratic seat because she's fighting for that district.
Thank you for the talk. It was very informative. My name is Kumail. I'm a junior in the college majoring in government. I'm from California, Bay Area. I was wondering, you mentioned in your discussion that something like a third of millennials are independents or unaffiliated with any party. Do you think that will rise in the coming years? And do you think that might lead to a rise of independent, unaffiliated candidates?
Great question. So about a third of Florida voters are registered as independents. Millennials are registering by a factor of 2 to 1, 3 to 1 as independents because they're, sort of disenfranchised with both parties. I think we can go deeper into that. But because of that trend, I think you might see a better shot maybe in 2020 of maybe even a split ticket. Right? There's talk of a Republican and a Democrat running for president. Maybe a strong independent. There's a lot of talk about had Bloomberg run as an independent, what would that have done in the last election? So we're getting to a point where you might see that. I would push back against that third party notion though, because the minute you put a policy on, say, guns or choice or climate change or infrastructure spending, or tax reform. Pick an issue. The minute you put, pen to paper and say yes or no on it, people say, oh, wait a minute, I don't know. I liked you when you were kind of vague and just kind of out there. Once you get specific, I don't know. So I think in theory you see more of that. But if millennials continue to stay frustrated and say, I don't like either party, I'm just not voting, I don't like any of you, I'm just staying home, then you're going to see more and more movements toward extremes.
Hi, I'm Tina. I'm a first-year MVP. So you kind of mentioned gun control as just a hot-button issue. So in the context of how much gridlock there is right now, do you think that that's an issue we can ever hope to see some real alliance on, or some, I don't know, kind of return to moderation, since a lot of polls reflect, a willingness on behalf of most of the American public to have some reforms in that area?
So very sadly, I don't think we will see anything happen on guns after Vegas. And it is a perfect example of some of the challenges we're talking about tonight. The American people, even Second Amendment advocates, which I am one, know we can do better on our current gun laws. But the reality is, based on how the Congress is designed, we'll never see that, because the reward comes for doing nothing, not for actually doing something. For me, my personal experience on it was after the Pulse nightclub in Orlando. Some of you may remember there was a sit-in on the House floor by House Democrats. And Republicans decided at the leadership level, we're not engaging, we're not doing anything. Now, the issue that emerged from there, and typically after a mass shooting like we saw in Vegas, there will be one or two issues that say, well, what about this, right? With Vegas, it's the bump stocks. With Pulse, it was no fly, no buy. The gentleman who purchased and I shouldn't call him a gentleman, but the shooter who purchased the firearm was on the no-fly list. And so the Democrats were demanding that a law that says if you're on the no-fly list, you shouldn't be able to buy a firearm. I believe that was polling at about 90%, right? It's common sense. If you can't board a plane, you shouldn't be able to buy a firearm. The problem with their proposal was there was no due process. And so for myself, who is a Second Amendment person, I said, well, wait a minute, if you're going to deny the right to purchase a firearm, the individual is entitled to due process, and the government should have to make its case. So I actually wrote a compromise bill that said, yes, no fly, no buy. If you're on the list, you can't buy a gun. But if you're denied the right, you're due an expedited hearing in 30 days. The government has the burden of proof 5149. It's a closed court hearing to protect your privacy and the interests of the government. If they prove it, then you can't buy a gun. If they can't, then you can buy a gun. One CNN anchor said it makes too much sense. We had, I believe, a deal. We had the votes. I in the middle of the night, worked with a bunch of Democrats on the House floor and said, hey, how about this? I knew I could only get about 30 to 35 votes on my side of the aisle on any gun control measure, but I had it. I had the votes there. The other side of the aisle, I believe they had the votes as well, but much like Patrick's experience on his budget bill, I had a Democratic colleague come to me the next day and said, hey, bad news. A certain member of Democratic leadership sent out a notice. None of us are to work with Jolly on this because we're spending $3 million to beat him in November. So here we had an answer to a reasonable gun control measure after Pulse. On one side of the aisle, mine, they weren't going to bring it up because of the influence of big money in the NRA, but frankly, because that position is protected by these supermajority districts, these very ideological districts. And on the other side of the aisle, it was pure politics and frankly, money they were investing to beat me, that they weren't going to bring it up. After Vegas, we can have broad conversations on gun control, but even look at what Congress did on bump stocks. So they identified this one thing, right, which probably should have already been illegal. Even as easy as that was, even with the NRA saying, yeah, we'll support prohibiting bump stocks. What did Paul Ryan do? He said, well, we think this should be done through regulation. Why did he do that? Because he doesn't want his side of the aisle to have to take a vote on gun control. And so they can say, yeah, let the ATF regulate bump stocks, we'll support that, but they're not going to do anything on this. Congress isn't going to do a single thing.
Can I ask one last question here? That's kind of a somber note to end on. Would either of you consider going back, and why or why not?
Congress?
Yes.
Because after this tour, we're so welcome back.
You can't repeat a souffle.
Yeah, but I'll go first. I used to give a tour of Congress and go down the basement, and as you're bringing friends up to the House floor, there's these like white marble steps, and there's these brown spots on it, and I was pointing them out, and I said, look, this is where, two members of Congress got in a fight. One pulled a dagger and stabbed the other member of Congress. So I say, as bad as you think things are now, we're not stabbing each other, right? We're not there yet. Our government, our democracy was designed to be very deliberative. It was designed to be methodical. We are seeing more of this dysfunction than ever because of cell phones and computers and news and this not even 24-hour news cycle, this 24-minute news cycle that we live in. So we're seeing so much. We're so up close to this. So I always try to remind people to keep that in mind as you're thinking about this dysfunction, how bad it is. Keep it in perspective that there's been times where it's been worse, right? We've pulled daggers and shot each other, and it's been really ugly. We usually come out ahead. Maybe it's ugly along the way, maybe it's slow. I hope I get an opportunity to run for something again. There were some great days where I felt like I was making a difference. Right? There were some days where I felt like I was helping seniors and helping veterans, and just the constituent service piece I thought was impactful. Being on the Intelligence Committee, being involved in issues that are bigger than any of us, right? Really neat stuff. But going back to the House now, the way it is, wouldn't make much sense to me because you're beating your head against the wall. There's no real action. There's no real leadership on these issues. And I think there's a lot of other ways to affect change, like talking to you all, and hopefully get out there and either do it yourself, vote, get your friends to vote, get a ballot initiative. There's so many ways to get active, and we can all make a difference.
So we haven't seen daggers, but we have seen a few fights on the House floor. That's a true story. Listen, I would go back. I would welcome that opportunity. I'm not sure I'm excited today about that prospect, but I would go back because I deeply believe in the institution, and I think we all should. One of the reasons Patrick and I are talking about some of these problems is so that we can talk about fixing them and the importance of getting involved. And I think if anybody has an opportunity to serve, you should strongly consider it. And so I may decide to go back at some point, but I would, just as I say that, encourage you to consider how you intend to get involved. And it may be through working with an advocacy group, it may be through your local party, it may be deciding to run for political office at some point. What I often encourage people to do, particularly who are still in school, take time to pursue the career that you know is right for you, for your family, for the stability financially for you. Don't just jump out of college and say, I'm going to start running for office. That usually doesn't make the best candidates. But consider how you're going to contribute. And hopefully one day that might include you being on the ballot as well, and possibly serving in Congress and being able to fix the things that Patrick and I were unable to do while we were there.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
This has been a great evening, and I really want to thank these two for showing us what Congress could be, and maybe will be again someday. And thank you to Georgetown, and thank you all for coming and for believing in the system, which I hope you do since you showed up.